Rocket Ethereal here. My ongoing goal has been to get good at Rogue Legacy or die trying, and that has meant acing the game as much as is possible. Now, in my previous videos I've showed you what New Game Plus looks like and how it increases the overall difficulty of the entire castle by upgrading all the enemies. Well, when you enter New Game Plus 2, all of the enemies are boosted up to their third and final form. In brief, this means a lot of projectiles, very high health and high damage enemies, and a lot of grinding to get all the upgrades. But after getting all the upgrades, there wasn't a whole lot left to do except face the remix bosses. Now, the way the remix bosses work is after you have beaten the bosses at least once in the regular story mode, you have a chance of getting a special obol that will permanently unlock access to one of 4 remix bosses. Each of the remix bosses is a hugely overpowered version of the regular boss. So as you can see here, I'm just now taking out Neo Kidir, and he was really just the easiest because he boiled entirely down to a couple different patterns of projectiles that just had to be memorized and dodged around. Wasn't all that crazy. However, compared to the rest of the castle, he was quite a challenge. I want to say he took me about 10 attempts, which is actually not that much compared to how long it took me to beat any of these other remix bosses. Ponce de Freon was especially difficult because, let me explain something about these guys to you. Every remix boss you must fight as a specific hero that is already picked out for you. So you enter the remix boss's room as whatever hero you bring into the castle, and then it switches you to a very specific hero. So in this case, this hero is able to use his Barbarian Shout 5 times, which will clear all nearby projectiles that this boss leaves behind. So you have to plan out how you're going to use the resources that you're given with the specific hero you have to beat that remix boss with very carefully. I know that I can't blow my Barbarian Shouts too quickly or I'm absolutely screwed. So I had to try to wait as long as possible before using one, which is why I'm moving very strategically around the map here, trying to dodge through his little orbs that he leaves behind, sometimes failing to do so. Thankfully, since this hero is a Barbarian King, he comes with a lot of health, and while Ponce de Freon deals 100 damage per hit, that still means I can get hit 5 times. That honestly leaves a lot of room for error. Something interesting about this fight though, just because of how difficult it is, because of how quickly the boss moves, you have to really learn everything there is to learn about this boss. You may ask, well, what can you possibly learn? This looks like such a simple encounter. He moves around. When he pauses, you know he's going to charge, which he may do more than once in a row. And he just chases after you and deals a lot of damage when you either touch him or one of the projectiles he leaves behind. Well, here's the thing. He is restricted on his movement. You'll notice, if you watch that again, that I was kind of playing his rate of curvature. So I was dancing around where he was unable to touch me by taking advantage of the fact that he could only turn so quickly. I would say that he was the second hardest of the first 4 remix bosses, and you'll see what I mean by first 4 later. Even though Herodotus, who is the 4th remix boss, is in the Land of Darkness, which is the hardest region of the castle, I actually found him to be the easiest of all the remix bosses. This fight is unlike anything else in the entire game, because as you can see, the hero that you have to fight this boss with is the Dragon class, which means unlimited flight. And you have to use that unlimited flight to beat this boss. Not only that, but the room is asteroids style, meaning that whatever goes off the screen in one direction will reappear on the other side of the screen with the same momentum, continuing in that direction. And what this means is that as the boss splits up, there starts to be little pieces of him all over the place. Now, I actually handled this fight very poorly, because the smart thing to do would have been to min-max the fight. Would have been to minimize the number of enemies that are actually on the screen by focusing them down one at a time. Now, every time you actually damage this boss, they will split off, but if you're only hitting one piece as it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, that's going to leave you with the smallest number of enemies possible. I just said screw it, and somehow everything turned out okay. If you are struggling with this boss, I highly advise that you handle the red part of the boss first, because the red part actually moves faster than the green part. So if you don't touch the green part at all, it's much easier to deal with that last. Because even if you don't touch the red part while you're fighting the green part, the red one is still going to be faster than the green one, and it might be more difficult to avoid. Another fun quirk, that's the only boss that actually is dropping health and mana potions all the time, but they just fall right off screen and disappear. They don't come out the other side of the screen like everything else does in that fight. This was the most difficult of all of the remix bosses by very far. You see, I am stuck with the Hokage, and the Hokage is very fragile, very high damage, unable to critically hit, and I've got two abilities at my disposal here. My spell is Quantum Translocator, or Relocator. I think it's Relocator. And what that lets me do is drop a shadow where I'm standing, and then when I hit my spell button again, it will return me to the location of my shadow. That's one of the two methods I use to traverse the map back and forth as I'm fighting this boss, because you can't just walk through that wall of spikes that's in the middle there. That's not going to happen. So you either use Quantum Relocator or you use his Replacements Technique ability, which will kind of teleport him forward a pretty good distance and for very cheap. And that's the main tool that I use to pass over the wall of spikes. You'll see me using it over and over and over and over again. And you'll see that my health right now is pretty low, but thankfully I have some Vampirism gear on this pre-made hero. So every time I destroy one of his many little skulls, which he just spawns these things all over the place. Every time I kill one of them, it gives me 4 health and 4 mana back. Now, you really have to play this fight in order to succeed at it, unless you're just incredibly skilled. And the reason I say that is because of how much damage the skulls and Alexander IV himself deal in comparison to the spikes. If it looks like you're going to take damage, the smartest thing to do is actually to voluntarily touch the spikes so that you've got some moments of invulnerability to get away from all the enemies, and it kind of gives you just a chance to recuperate and think about where you're going to go next. I had to look up a lot of guides for how to beat that fight, but my advice, just practice it yourself. Nobody else's method is going to be better for you than how you figured out how to fight that fight, and believe me, there are actually quite a few methods. Lastly, we have Bro Hanus, and we're way past spoilers at this point. So this boss fight is essentially two slightly weaker versions of the main story boss, except with a lot of health. So they spam the same spells that the boss uses, except that they have fewer projectiles in their 2 projectile spells. So normally the boss would throw 5 axes into the air or fire 5 daggers forward. These guys only fire 3 of each, but you have to deal with 2 of them simultaneously. Now, you have 700 health with the hero that you're using here, and since you take 100 damage if anything hits you, if the Guardian Blades hit you, if they touch you, if they randomly decide to whack you, which they do a lot because there's no rhyme or reason behind when they decide to whack you, except that maybe they'll try to do it if you're within melee attack range, maybe. They're incredibly unpredictable about that. It's really difficult, but not nearly so difficult as the Alexander fight, because you also have the hyper somethingism trait. I can't remember what exactly it's called, but it gives you increased knockback every time you deal damage. And so that allows you to sort of area control both of them. But you have to play it in a very reactive way. You have to kind of see what they're doing. If they're standing still, then you kind of just jump in and try to take a swing at them and just keep them pushed back as much as possible. Now, I got kind of lucky in that I was able to take one out so quickly because they do both have the same amount of health, and it's almost impossible to just focus one down unless you've got some incredible skills and reaction time. But somehow I managed to do that in this fight, and even though I'm one hit away from death, I do eventually manage to dodge over and finish off the last of the twins. And this actually unlocks a secret class for permanent use, and that is the Trader. You unlock all of their abilities, so your special abilities are replaced with theirs, but you're relatively weak otherwise, so it's kind of more of just a fun gimmick. The axes are pretty ineffective, or inefficient I should say, not ineffective. There's a lot of projectiles, so they can deal a lot of damage, but it's not very practical. That said, mission accomplished. It was a long and hard journey, and I am just not a fan of platformers in general, but since I loved Rogue Legacy so much, I managed to find the drive to get back in there and finish this one off, and it was well worth it. Especially because only under 2% of all people who own Rogue Legacy on Steam have actually finished everything there is to finish, so I would say that was a pretty good victory. Until next time, this is Rocket Ethereal, signing off.